She was supposed to last 1 season, maybe 2 if the Alberta winters didn't break her first. That was what Dougal Craine told himself the morning he drove 4 hours south to Lethbridge to pick up the woman who had answered his advertisement in the Ranchland Gazette. He'd been specific in the listing: strong back, early riser, comfortable with cattle, no complaints about mud. He had not expected, when he pulled up to the bus terminal and scanned the crowd, to find a young woman standing at the curb with a single canvas duffel bag, her dark hair pulled back under a plain wool cap, looking at him with the kind of steady, unimpressed gaze that usually belonged to people twice her age. Her name was Circe Dunn. She was 26 years old, and she had come from Cape Breton Island with calloused hands and a letter of reference from a sheep farmer in Inverness County that said, simply, "She works harder than anyone I've ever hired, and she left because she wanted to, not because I wanted her gone." Dougal read that letter twice in the truck on the way back north. Then he folded it and put it in his glove compartment and didn't say a word about it. He said almost nothing the whole drive. He told her the property was 1,200 acres. He told her the bunkhouse had heat, but the hot water ran cold after 6 in the morning. He told her his last 2 ranch hands had quit in November, one because of the cold and one because of him, and he did not elaborate on either. Circe sat with her duffel on her lap and watched the foothills come up through the windshield and said, "What kind of cattle?" "Black Angus. 400 head. How many horses?" 7. 3 working, 2 that think they're working, 2 that have given up entirely. She almost smiled at that. He didn't notice because he was watching the road. The Craine property sat at the base of the Porcupine Hills, an hour outside the nearest town, which was small enough that its only amenities were a gas station, a feed store, and a Ukrainian church that doubled as a community hall on Saturday nights. The ranch house was old and square and functional. The barn needed paint. The fencing along the north pasture had been repaired so many times it looked like a quilt. Circe stepped out of the truck and turned a slow circle, taking it in. "You said established," she said. "It is established. The east fence is leaning. It leans, but it holds." She picked up her bag. "Where's the bunkhouse?" He showed her. She thanked him with a nod and closed the door, and Dougal stood in the yard for a moment wondering what exactly he had just agreed to. He found out the next morning. He was in the barn at 5:30, same as always, working through the feeding routine he had done alone for the better part of 8 months. He had the rhythm of it memorized the way you memorize a song you never chose to learn. It was just in him, automatic. A little grim. He was halfway through when he heard boots on the concrete behind him, and turned to find Circe already there. Coat on, gloves in her back pocket, looking at the feeding schedule he'd tacked to the post. "You're giving them too much hay in the morning," she said. "They need more in the evening when the temperature drops. They burn it overnight." He stared at her. "I've been running cattle for 15 years. "Then you know I'm right." He turned back to the hay. "You've been here 12 hours. The animals don't care how long I've been here." He didn't answer. But that evening, he adjusted the feeding schedule. He didn't tell her. She noticed anyway, and also didn't say anything, and somehow that was worse. The first 2 weeks were a negotiation conducted almost entirely in silence. Dougal had built his life around a certain kind of quiet. The functional quiet of a man who had lived alone too long and forgotten that other people had opinions about things. He made decisions. He did the work. He went to bed tired and woke up early and did it again. There had been a time when the ranch had other voices in it. His mother had died 11 years ago. His father 3 years after that. A woman named Helen had lasted 2 winters before she packed her things one April morning and drove away without leaving a note, and Dougal had never quite forgiven himself for not being surprised. So Circe didn't fill the silence so much as she occupied it differently. She worked from first light to last, without complaint or commentary, but when she had something to say, she said it. She told him the Northwest water trough had a crack in the liner that was going to split by February. She was right. She told him 2 of the Angus cows were showing early signs of pink eye and needed to be separated. She was right about that too. She asked him once, over coffee she'd made herself in the bunkhouse and brought to the barn without asking whether he wanted any, "How long have you been running this place on your own?" He accepted the coffee before he answered, "Long enough." That's not an answer. 8 months. She nodded and looked out the barn door at the gray morning. That's a long time to be the only one who knows everything. He didn't know what to say to that, so he drank the coffee. By the third week, without either of them deciding anything, they had fallen into a rhythm that felt less like an employer and a hired hand, and more like two people who happened to be solving the same problem from different angles. Dougal ordered supplies. Saoirse reorganized the storage shed so they could actually find them. He knew the land. She knew cattle biology at a level that embarrassed him slightly, because she'd spent 2 winters on a beef operation in Saskatchewan before Cape Breton and had read, apparently, every veterinary extension pamphlet ever published by Agriculture Canada. She caught him reading one of those pamphlets one evening. He'd taken it off the shelf in the tack room where she'd left a stack of them. "You can keep that," she said, from the doorway. "I was just looking at it. He's been reading for 20 minutes. He put it back on the shelf. She picked it up and handed it to him. "Take it," she said. "There's no prize for not knowing things." He took the pamphlet. He read the whole thing that night. The cold came hard in November, which was expected, and with it came the first real test of whether two people who had agreed on almost nothing could function as something more than parallel workers in the same frozen yard. A storm came down from the mountains on a Tuesday. The kind of Alberta storm that doesn't announce itself properly, that goes from cloudy to whiteout in the time it takes to walk from the house to the barn. They were both outside when it hit. Dougal knew the property well enough to navigate blind. Saoirse did not, but she followed his voice, and he talked her into the barn doorway without thinking about it much, and they spent 3 hours in the barn together, waiting for the worst of it to pass. Dougal sat on a hay bale. Saoirse sat on the ground with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up, and after a while she said, "How many storms like this a year?" 4 or 5 that come fast. Maybe 2 that last. And before, when you were alone, what did you do? Stayed in the barn. By yourself. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the snow driving sideways past the door. "That sounds terrible," she said. It had been. He hadn't admitted that to himself until she said it out loud. They didn't talk much after that, but the quality of the silence changed. It was less like 2 strangers being careful and more like 2 people who had agreed, without saying so, that they could stop pretending the other one wasn't there. December arrived with more cold and a problem. His neighbor to the north, a man named Fergus Ault, who had been trying to buy the Craine property for 6 years, sent a letter. The letter was politely worded and deeply unwelcome. It claimed that a stretch of fence along the shared property line had been placed, by his survey, 3 meters inside Ault's land. It requested that Dougal remove the fence and the cattle that grazed behind it, and it included the name of a solicitor in Calgary. Dougal read it at the kitchen table. Then he set it down. Saoirse came in from the cold, saw his face and said, "What happened?" He handed her the letter. She read it twice. "Is he right about the fence?" she asked. "I don't know. My father built it." "That's not the same as it being in the right place." "I know that." He pushed back from the table. "I know that." She didn't say anything else right away. She made tea, which she did when she was thinking, and she set a cup in front of him without asking. Then she sat down across from him with her own cup and said, "You need someone to look at the original survey. Not Alt's survey, your family's. That could take months, or it could take 3 weeks if you find the right person." She found the right person. She had a contact, a former classmate from an agricultural land management program in Truro, who now worked as a licensed surveyor in Red Deer. The woman came out the following week, spent a day walking the property line, and told Dougal that the fence was, in fact, 6 inches inside his land, not outside it, and that Alt's survey had used a benchmark that had been repositioned in 1987. Dougal stood in the snow looking at the documentation and felt something loosen in his chest. "How did you know to look for that?" he asked Saoirse on the drive back from meeting the surveyor. She shrugged. "My father lost 2 acres to a bad survey when I was 10. I watched him spend 4 years trying to get it back." She paused. "He didn't." "I'm sorry." "So was he." She looked out the window at the bare fields. "I just remembered what he wished he'd done differently." Alt's solicitor went quiet after receiving the counter-survey. Alt himself sent no further letters. But Dougal knew, from 15 years of being his neighbor, that the man did not give up on things he wanted. He simply waited. January was brutal and long. The heating system in the barn developed a fault in the 3rd week, and they spent 2 days working in temperatures that made every task take 3 times as long. Dougal's older gelding, a big red animal named after nobody because Dougal didn't name horses, developed a respiratory infection that required twice-daily medication and round-the-clock monitoring for 4 days. So Wearsay took the night shifts without being asked, sleeping in 2-hour intervals on the folded horse blanket in the tack room, and on the third morning Dougal came in at 4 a.m. to find her asleep on the floor with her cheek on her jacket and the horse standing quiet above her. And he stood there longer than he needed to before he turned around and went back to the house. He started making breakfast in the mornings. He didn't announce this. He just made 2 portions instead of 1 and left hers on the counter before she came in. She ate it without comment. After a week she started showing up 5 minutes earlier, which was the only acknowledgement either of them made. The horse recovered. Wearsay told him not to be sentimental about it. "I'm not sentimental," he said. "You looked like you were going to cry when the fever broke." "I was tired." "You were relieved. That's allowed." He wasn't sure lately what was allowed. The edges of things had become less clear. He found himself saving observations during the day, the way the light hit the south pasture in the afternoon, something one of the cows had done that was almost funny. For the evenings when they sat in the barn or the kitchen or the truck, waiting for the heater to work, he found himself listening for her boots on the step. He told himself it was just the isolation. 1,200 acres in January with another person you trusted was different from 1,200 acres alone. That was all it was. He almost believed it. Alt's Hout made his next move in February. He had apparently found, or manufactured, another angle. This time it was water rights, a seasonal creek that ran through both properties and that had, in a dry summer 2 years prior, nearly run dry. Alt's position, delivered through his solicitor, was that a historical diversion his grandfather had built upstream gave him prior claim to the creek's output in drought conditions. If upheld, it meant Dougal's cattle would have no reliable water source in a dry summer. The legal document was 62 pages long. Dougal dropped it on the kitchen table and sat down heavily. Cyrus picked it up. She read for an hour. He made dinner because he needed something to do with his hands. "He's not wrong that the diversion existed," she said when she set the document down. "But the Water Act doesn't work the way his solicitor is claiming. Riparian rights in Alberta aren't based on historical construction. They're based on allocation licenses." Dougal looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I read things." She tapped the document. His grandfather never filed for an allocation license, which means the diversion was there, but the legal right wasn't. "Can you prove that?" "You need someone who can pull the provincial water license registry, but yes, I think it can be proved." She was right. It took 3 weeks and a water rights lawyer in Calgary who charged more per hour than Dougal liked to think about, but the provincial registry showed no license registered to Alt or any prior owner of his property for that creek diversion. The claim failed. Alt's solicitor sent a final letter that was considerably shorter than the previous ones. They were sitting on the tailgate of Dougal's truck the evening after the lawyer called with the news, looking out at the south pasture in the last of the winter light. The sky was doing something extraordinary over the Porcupine Hills, going through 4 colors at once the way Alberta skies sometimes did when you weren't expecting it. And neither of them said anything for a while. "He's not going to stop," Dougal said. "No," Wearsay agreed. "People like that don't. I've been fighting him for years. Before you came, I was fighting him alone." She looked at him sideways. "You could have lost," she said. "I know. You almost did. The survey thing. If you'd accepted his numbers, I didn't. You might have, if there'd been no one to tell you to look harder." He was quiet for a moment. The sky kept moving. "I'm not good at accepting help," he said. "I noticed. I'm better than I was." She turned to look at him then, and there was something in her expression that he hadn't seen before, or hadn't let himself see. "I know," she said, more quietly. He had thought for a long time that the ranch was the thing he was holding on to, that everything he did was in service of the land his father had left him and his father before that, and that keeping it was its own kind of purpose. Enough of the purpose, anyway. Enough to justify the 8 months alone, the years of not naming horses, the April morning he hadn't gone after Helen's taillights when they disappeared down the drive. He still believed all of that, but he had started to understand, somewhere in the middle of a February, that had tried hard to beat them, that holding on to something alone was a different thing from building something with someone who chose to be there. Cersei's lease on the bunkhouse ran to the end of March. She didn't bring it up. He didn't bring it up. The last week of March came and went without either of them saying anything and without her packing any bags, and Dougal decided that was an answer. Spring came the way Alberta springs always did. Later than you wanted, and faster than you were ready for. The creek ran full and clear. The south pasture went green in what felt like a single week. The Angus herd cycled through calving season with the lowest loss rate Dougal had seen in a decade, because Sareers had identified 3 at-risk pregnancies in February and they'd managed them carefully, going out together in the dead of night with flashlights when the time came. Dougal named one of the calves. He didn't tell Cersei he'd done it. She found out because she heard him use the name in the field. "You named a cow," she said that evening. "I named a calf. You don't name animals. I named that one." She considered this for a moment. "What did you name it?" "Persistence." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she started laughing, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't heard from her, the kind that changed her face entirely. And he found he was smiling before he decided to. "That's either the most Canadian thing I've ever heard," she said, "or the most you thing. Maybe both." She shook her head, still laughing a little. "Persistence. God help us." Alt made one more attempt in May. This time it was an offer to buy. A formal offer, through a real estate agent, for a figure that was just high enough to make a person look twice and just low enough to be insulting. Dougal called the agent and said no. Then he went and found Cersei in the north pasture and told her. She was fixing the leaning fence. She had been planning to fix it since October. "How much?" she asked. He told her. She set down the fence tool. "That's an insult dressed up as a number." "That's what I told them." "Good." She picked the tool back up. He stood there. "I want to ask you something," he said. She kept working. "I want to know if you'd consider not just working here." He stopped. Started again. "I want to know if you'd consider staying. As a partner. Half the operation. Your name on the property." She was quiet for long enough that he started to regret saying it. Then she set down the fence tool again and turned around. Her expression was hard to read, the way it often was, except that her eyes were doing something that wasn't indifference. "You're serious," she said. "I'm always serious. You named a calf Persistence, and now you're offering me half your land." "Yes." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked out at the pasture, at the full creek and the green grass and the herd moving slow and steady in the afternoon sun. And whatever she was thinking, she took her time with it. "I didn't come here for this," she said. "I know. I came because I needed work. I know that too. And you need to understand that I'm not interested in being a silent partner. I'll have opinions about the cattle, about the finances, about the fencing and the water management and the breeding program and every other thing. I know. I'll be right about most of them. You have been so far." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than that. "Half," she said. "Half. And refix the east barn roof before winter." "The east barn roof is on the list. It needs to be at the top of the list." "Fine. Top of the list." She picked up the fence tool and turned back to the post she'd been working on. "Then yes," she said with her back to him. "I'll stay." He stood in the north pasture for a moment with the wind coming off the hills, and he thought about his father, who had built this place alone, and his mother, who had helped build it and never got the credit, and Helen driving away in the early morning, and 8 months of feeding 400 cattle in silence, and 3 February nights on the barn floor. And he thought, so this is what it's supposed to feel like. He picked up a fence post and held it steady while she worked. They fixed the east barn roof in September. They hired 2 more hands by October. Cersei's name went on the title in June, at a solicitor's office in town that was not, pointedly, the one Fergus Alt had used. Alt sent no more letters after the May offer. Whether he'd given up or was simply waiting again, Dougal couldn't say, but the land was whole, and the creek ran where it had always run, and the herd went into winter healthy and well-fed, managed by 2 people who had learned, through a year of cold mornings and bad storms and legal threats, and one stubbornly named calf, that the thing worth holding on to wasn't always just the land. Sometimes it was the person standing next to you in the north pasture, setting the post straight, telling you the fence had been leaning since October and it was long past time.